Good morning, everybody. I'm going to introduce Erin Hudson, who will be presenting today on breast food as food for life. And Erin Hudson is a Kiwi who has been a leader in immunization education for over 30 years. She has a Bachelor of Health Science gained after years of working in a wide range of healthcare settings, including nursing, lactation clinics, and managing a naturopathic and massage practice. She has taught for over 20 years at the prestigious South Pacific College of Natural Medicine in Auckland, and now writes learning programs for a private education provider. So let's welcome Erin Hudson.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Great. So good morning, everybody. In New Zealand, we say tēnā koutou. So tēnā koutou means welcome to every single person here in the room, including the little ones. So my background is varied, and I pretty much put up everything I could think of there so that you could think about where this talk has come from. It certainly hasn't come from one place. It's come from meeting lots of people, working in lots of different areas, and it's also come from being a grandma recently, because I've gone through the entire breastfeeding experience all over again. So Christina has asked me specifically to talk about why breast milk, or why human milk, is so good for any baby and any young child. And I'm going to start off by looking at why it's crucial for baby's immune system to have breast milk as its starter food. Then halfway through the talk, you'll hear me starting to talk about the benefits of breastfeeding, and that's also for the family and the community and the environment. And then lastly, when I get to the normalising breastfeeding slide, you'll know we're almost at the end, and that's when I'm going to be giving suggestions to everyday people about how they can support breastfeeding in the community. So that's where we're heading today. A good talk always starts with some definitions, because often people have their own idea about what words mean. So these are global definitions which are taken all over the world, so from the World Health Organization all the way through to what we do in New Zealand. And the definitions are broken up into 4. So there's exclusive breastfeeding, first of all, and that is specifically when a baby is only accessed breast milk, whether that's donor milk or whether that's express breast milk, and that's all they've had in what the term is 48 hours prior. Someone who is fully breastfeeding means pretty much the same as exclusive, except there may have been some water or there may have been some medication also given to that baby in that 48-hour period. The third one is the partial breastfeeding, and partially is when that baby is having some breast milk but also some infant formula as part of their nutrition. And then finally, we have artificial feeding, when the baby has only had infant formula and no breast milk at all in that previous 48 hours. So that's our definitions for the talk today. I'm going to add another one of my own, and that's this one by a woman called Sheila Kitzinger, who recently passed away, but she has written about birth, breastfeeding, and women's experiences and men's experiences as parents for several decades. So she says that breastfeeding is not a matter of filling up the baby with milk, as you might fill up the tank of a car. Breastfeeding is an intimate dialogue between two people. And I'm going to add at this point that for some families who choose infant formula over breastfeeding for whatever reason, that intimate dialogue can also be very, very apparent. The World Health Organization, which always has something to say about something, they estimate that 1 in 3 infants under 6 months, if they were exclusively breastfed, would be ideal. However, the rate has not improved in over 2 decades. They also say that children up to the age of 2, if they were optimally breastfed, so I'm not sure what optimally breastfed means because it doesn't come into our categories, but what they're saying is over 800,000 children under the age of 5 could be saved every year. So that's a phenomenal amount of children who aren't surviving simply because they don't have access to human milk. How that breaks down into money, because that's how we tend to think of it more so than people, unfortunately. In the States, it's been looked at with Batrick and Renhold. They did a study in 2010, and their final reflection at the end of their study was that if 90% of babies were exclusively breastfed for 6 months, then that would be a saving of $13 billion. And so for that, they took into account hospitalisations, medications, time off work, and all those other types of categories. So it's going to save us lots of money if we encourage breastfeeding, but first of all, let's find out why it's so critically important to have it for babies. The microbiome is probably a word that you've heard quite a lot recently. As a naturopath, I've heard about this word for over 30 years, and I think that our medical professionals are just catching up. But essentially, where the baby gets their microbiome from is from the mother's microbiome. So in order to her to think about having a successful and a healthy pregnancy with a wonderful outcome at the other end, a healthy baby, she, prior to the pregnancy, has to look at her own nutrition, her own environment, and her own stress levels, because that will all have an effect on her microbiome. Once father, family, and environment can also affect her microbiome, but people living with her, and that's also critical to look at prior to baby coming. During the birth, the amniotic fluid is the main area that the microbiome gets its beneficial start from. And also for women who have caesarean section, not a vaginal delivery, there's something called seeding, which is just a matter of having that baby exposed to some of that mucosa, some of that amniotic fluid, prior to them starting their first feed. Placental blood also has a lot of microbiome benefits, and not only does it help with baby when they're initially born to create lots of extra blood cells to support their oxygen levels, but the placental blood also contains stem cells and probiotics, which is another aspect of having that microbiome start to work properly. And then lastly, we come to human milk, which is essentially a blood product. It's no different to the blood plasma that we have running through our veins, but it just comes out through the breast tissue, the mammary glands. But human milk is bursting with bacteria. You couldn't get something that's got more bacteria in it. And ongoing probiotics for baby through that through the first months, but certainly through the entire time that the baby is breastfeeding. And having probiotics come from the breast is certainly a lot cheaper than having to go and buy it at the health food shop. Now, this little schematic I have borrowed from Suzanne Humphreys with her permission, and it's just a way for you to have an idea about how the microbiome fits in with what we call the 3-year pregnancy. So this little part here is pre-pregnancy, and this entire circle is the entire environment prior to that pregnancy. So we've got chemicals, we've got stress, we've got people who live with us, we've got family, all of the wonderful things that can influence a woman prior to her pregnancy is taken into consideration in that very, very small part there. I actually think that should be probably this size, but that's not the nature of this talk. So what happens in the very, very beginning of pregnancy is the placenta starts to function as essentially that baby's intermediary between mum and baby. And the entire pregnancy, her body starts to go into what we call a anti-inflammatory state, which means that when the baby first of all fertilises and impregnates in her uterus, the woman's body says, this is strange, this is a foreign object, I better set up what I would normally do to get rid of a foreign object. But what happens is the immune system completely dampens down and slows down so that essentially the baby gets to stay, ideally. In that time, the maternal microbiome and the immune system is all set up so that the baby can happily sit there until the very, very end of the pregnancy, when a lot of other things occur. But what also can occur is her immune system will start to shift again and return to her pre-pregnancy state. So part of that immune system changing again might mean that her eczema comes back, might mean that her asthma starts to return, because in that middle phase of the pregnancy, she's had none of those symptoms because they are all inflammatory and caused from inflammatory immune responses and also from inflammatory foods. Going into the first 2 years of the baby's life, we have essentially the infant gut microbiome, which has had all of those benefits from mum's microbiome. And we have the real advantage of breast milk keeping the baby's immune system non-reactive. So keeping it anti-inflammatory and allowing the immune system to very, very slowly over time start to function in much the way that an immune system would function in an adult. So this is a lovely schematic. It comes from one of Suzanne's talks, neonatal immunity, and there's 6 parts to it. And I really encourage you, if you're interested in the immune system as well as breast milk, to go back and have a look at it. So what's in human milk? It comes in all shapes and colours and sizes, but essentially it's a dynamic fluid which is perfectly created for that baby, and it's a baby's right to have access to that breast milk when it arrives. It's perfectly designed for that infant, no matter what age or stage that baby has been born in. So premature, overdue, toddlers, all the milk changes for that particular infant. And just how clever it is that the breast milk has been tested and over various women over various times to show that there's actually different compositions for male and female babies. It's also been shown that for the infant or the toddler, the milk changes its taste. And if it's a really hot day outside, that milk gets thinner, so it's more hydrating. And if it's really hot outside, if it's hot outside, it gets thinner. And if it's cold outside, the milk gets thinner and richer for that baby. So just the weather can also affect the constitution and the type and the flavour of the milk. It also overcomes microbes every single day. So if you have a baby who wanders off and gets kissed by an auntie or picks up a fly on the windowsill and comes back with all sorts of germs, essentially what will happen within a 3-hour turnaround period is the mother's body will have already made some antibodies to create for that baby immediate immune support. You don't have to go to the shop, don't have to go to the doctor, just need to feed that baby, and they will have encouraged and produced that next round of antibodies for their, basically for their survival. Something that's also really interesting about breast milk is that when it mixes with saliva, it creates a reaction which is known as hydrogen peroxide. And for those of you who've used hydrogen peroxide in your first aid kits, it's a wonderful remedy for getting rid of any type of opportunist pathogens. So just the fact that there's saliva on the mother's breast and there's milk on the mother's breast, that is creating the perfect environment to reduce any type of staph infection for that mum's nipples. How effective is it? This is a study which was done in 2013, and they recognised that when a baby was breastfed, immediately after the rotavirus oral vaccine, that the breast milk itself negated the vaccine. And I think that's pretty impressive. So what they were saying is, please don't feed your baby immediately afterwards. Please wait a few hours so that the rotavirus can do what the rotavirus needs to do, and then you can breastfeed later. So women were quite surprised, I think, in hearing about this, because it really did explain to them how amazing breast milk can be for something as simple as rotavirus, but also it can nuke a vaccine. Several years ago, 2003, there was some studies done, and more are still being done, with regard to something called the Hamlet cells. And the Hamlet cells have been proven over time to actually kill in tumour cells. So it's really interesting that they're starting to see that perhaps the child who's breastfed will also be having a protective effect from that with regard to any childhood tumours. But is it safe for everybody? This is a list that I took from the American Academy of Pediatrics website, and they listed several reasons or several conditions that would indicate that it wasn't best for everyone to be breastfed. So we have got women who have got HIV, we have women with human T-cell lymphotrophic virus, 1 or 2. We have women who've got chemotherapy or radiation therapy currently in their lives. And there are women who may be choosing to have drugs or alcohol as part of their lifestyle. Also, people who've got herpes simplex, that's important to make sure that there's no lesions. And then lastly, there's the instance of a baby if they have galactosemia, which is very, very rare, but it's picked up usually at birth, and so that would be another reason that that baby might not be best to have human milk because of the proteins in it. So what do we do if we can't give the baby breast milk? These days, certainly in New Zealand, we have people who provide donor milk for women who are choosing to breastfeed, but they might not have the supply or they might not have the ability to feed at that current time. And what's interesting about this photo is you'll initially think it's twins feeding. It's actually two different babies and they're just having lunch together. So one mum's decided to share, or one baby hasn't been able to access what they needed for that time. This is more of a unsettling study, but it's also a really good study to show that even though we consistently think about breast milk being a good nutritional source for our children, essentially it's far more than nutrition. And this is a study which was done in 2015 in a NICU, so we call that neonatal intensive care unit. I'm sure you do as well. And what they noticed is that the children who did not have access to breast milk, so whether that was donor milk, expressed milk, or the milk from their own mother, they were more at risk of being harmed by their family before they got to adulthood. Now, it's a really disturbing study, but what it's showing is that it isn't just the nutrition of the breast milk that's advantageous for the baby, but it's also to do with what's in the breast milk, especially around the hormonal process of that baby getting switched on, of that mother providing the best that they possibly could, and that bonding link that goes along with making sure that everyone's doing what they can for that baby's health. However, I really want to state that regardless of how a baby is born, you can simply not measure the mother and her love towards that baby. So regardless, you've still got that bonding. And in fact, human milk is so popular that we have had in the classes I teach several dads and several mums say that they have used breast milk, particularly if it's for like IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. We had one dad use it for Campylobacter pain. We had another one use it for Giardia pain. And it was simply the only thing that took away the gut pain. So obviously there were other things that they were doing as well, but using it as a pain relief was critical to those people getting over that acute situation. We have parents use it as a moisturiser, so for sore nipples, for eczema, for cuts and scratches and grazes, and certainly as a cleanser, like for eyes, for conjunctivitis, for any little spots in impetigo, anything that's on the skin, to actually start cleansing and start replenishing that tissue. So, hopefully that first part of the talk has shown to you that actually there's nothing at all immature, inadequate or inappropriate about a baby's immune system, that it's in fact perfect when the baby's born. And Suzanne Humphreys talks about it being a Ferrari with 8 wheels, so that's a big engine, and also those 8 wheels have got 8 wheel clamps. And so over time what happens is breast milk slowly and intelligently unlocks the wheel clamps. And as they're very, very slowly let go of, then you have that amazing power of the Ferrari immune system all set, all ready to go for adulthood. So what is good about breastfeeding for the baby? First of all, it helps with their digestive tract. So very, very rare for a breastfed baby to be constipated. If it can be constipated, sometimes there's just a delay in the timing of the bowel movement. But in actual fact, if the baby is continuously breastfed, that digestive tract will function eventually. There's also a reduced risk of any type of respiratory infections, and especially ear infections when the baby's being breastfed. So if you can imagine a baby lying feeding, what happens is the breast milk actually goes up into the eustachian tubes, but it sits there like a microbial, like a antimicrobial, and it bathes the tissue and it replenishes the tissue and it makes the tissue, do what it needs to do. If that eustachian tube has infant milk formula in that area, it's not sterile, and even water, it's not sterile. So that can set up inflammation, that can set up irritation, and that when we have a lot of children who get constant ear infections, it's simply because of the tissue that is being bathed in the incorrect type of fluid while that baby is so young. There's a lot of studies that suggest that breastfeeding also reduces obesity, cardiovascular disease, certain childhood cancers, autoimmune diseases, and particularly diabetes mellitus. For women who choose to breastfeed immediately after birth, what can happen is oxytocin, which is the hormone responsible for the contractions of labour. The oxytocin is released, and that actually encourages the uterus to contract, and it encourages less blood loss, and then it allows for the woman to actually have her uterus and her body start to return to normal again earlier than if she hadn't breastfed at all. Some women choose to breastfeed to help the placenta to come away, because the contractions of the uterus will help to expel it. And there's certainly a lot less stress when women breastfeed, because as well as oxytocin, there's another hormone called prolactin. Was essentially, prolactin when you breastfeed is like having a little bit of opium, believe it or not, to just allow that relaxation, to allow the shoulders to soften, and to allow that milk to flow easily. So that's a plus. And then for some women, there is weight loss after pregnancy because of breastfeeding. However, that really isn't 4 weeks of breastfeeding. That's like 6 months plus breastfeeding. And essentially, no woman wants to lose weight in that first 6 months, because her body is her feeding stores. And her thighs and her back and all the areas that she's put weight on, I like to refer to them as milk storage tanks. So hang on to those tanks, ladies, as long as you can, because that essentially will give you the strength to get through those first few months, and then at that point sometimes the weight can start to change then. There's also a reduced cancer risk for women who have breastfed, and that's for breastfeeding at least 6 months for any child. Which is really amazing to think that you've done something in an earlier part of your life and you're still reaping all the benefits for it post that experience. And the studies have continuously shown decreased risks with breast cancer, with ovarian cancer, endometrial cancers, and uterine cancers. So that's a real plus as well. Breastfeeding for the whole family means that there is reduced cost for healthcare. For parents, there's less time off work. Breastfed infants, as we've seen, are less likely to fall ill. Parents are less stressed about the illness that might occur, and also there's less chance of that child being hospitalised. So overall, for any government, pushing, promoting, supporting breastfeeding would be a certain way to decrease their budget with regarding hospital care. Not that exciting as that lot. Breastfeeding in the environment. This is a good thing to know about, is it's actually a naturally renewable resource that requires no packaging, shipping or disposal. Prolonged lactation also helps to promote the spacing of children. So were a woman to feed for an extended period of time, it's unlikely that her periods would come back, especially if she is feeding through the evening. So if she stops feeding at 8 at night and she doesn't start feeding again till, say, for example, 8 the next morning, then she's more likely to get her periods back because of that extended period through the evening time that she's not feeding. So then when she gets her period back, she's got that chance of another pregnancy. Whereas for women who have extended breastfeeding, amenorrhea, which is a normal state with a breastfeeding woman, then that next baby coming along is less likely. There's also less use of natural resources, for example, glass and plastic, metal and paper, which means less waste for our landfills. And some people will agree with me that also fully portable containers, which can be very easy on the eye. So global health, which is where we're heading, can also benefit from having breastfeeding women and breastfeeding families. Again, there's less to produce, to process, package, distribute, promote and dispose. And all of these factors are very much a part of the infant or the artificial baby milk manufacturing process. But yes, fast, free food is certainly breastfeeding compared to what else you can buy. Now, I'm just going to talk for a few moments about what happens in New Zealand before I look at what happens in America, and you'll be pleased to see that you've actually got better breastfeeding rates than we do. So this is at 52% at 6 weeks, which is great. 48% drops down a little bit at 3 months, and then unfortunately when we get to 6 months, remember this is exclusive breastfeeding, at 6 months we only have 21% of babies still being breastfed. However, we have in New Zealand a secret weapon, and our secret weapon is our Prime Minister, who currently is breastfeeding her 3-month-old baby. So this is her at a United Nations meeting, and she had just given her United Nations talk, and then she was surprised to see her baby was waiting for her back at the table. So this is her quote about breastfeeding. She says, "It's a necessity. I'm a breastfeeding mother, so I need to keep her alive." So that's a little bit about us. What's happening in the States currently, and this is your report card, which came out in 2018, that's what it's called. And you'll see over here is our 21% at 6 months, which is okay, but you've already got to 25% with your rates, which is much better. And remember, this is about exclusive breastfeeding, not fully, not partial. This is about just having only breast milk for that first 6 months of the life. There's a project which is called the Healthy People 2020 project in America, and its goal is to increase breastfeeding rates. They want to get up to 61% instead of 25%, which is very, very, very hopeful. And they're hoping too that once women start breastfeeding exclusively up to 6 months, that will certainly affect the bottom dollar with regard to how much is being paid out for healthcare. The Healthy People 2020 project is also looking at 8 objectives, of which 5 of them they have already met. So the ones they have met is increasing children to be breastfed full stop. They're also increasing the proportion of infants who are breastfed at 1 year, and they're also excluding the proportion of infants who are breastfed exclusively through 6 months. They have a lot more employers on track for creating worksite lactation support programs, which is great. And they also have increased the proportion of live births that occur in facilities that provide recommended care for lactating mothers and their babies. So 5 out of their 8 objectives are very commendable and they're on the way. But what they're looking at, and this is the same as New Zealand, is looking at increasing the proportion of infants who are breastfed at 6 months. So that's one that they want to focus on. Also increase the proportion of infants exclusively breastfed through the 6 months. And then the last one that they're still working on is to reduce the proportion of breastfed newborns who receive formula supplementation within the first 2 days of life. And that's a really critical place to start when we think about the microbiome. Because a breastfed baby, even if they were to have 10, 15 or 20 mils of infant formula, that will considerably change their bowel, their intestinal flora and their microbiome, even though it's just a small amount. So instead of having a very small baby given infant formula just in case or just because or for whatever reason, it's much more advantageous to the child to have access to donor breast milk or expressed milk from mum if she's unable to feed, to encourage that microbiome to continue as it would. We had one family who came to one of our classes and the mother was unable to breastfeed after about 6 weeks of age, and so she chose to look at donor milk in that situation. And over the baby's 8, 9, 10 months that we were aware of, the baby had up to 40 different women's expressed donor milk. So the microbiome of that infant would have been considerably different to anyone else in that family. And the microbiome actually created for that child a very, very sturdy and very robust immune system, because it essentially took on the village and took on every microbiome that it could. So it was pretty impressive. She'd chosen not to vaccinate her baby, so that's why her motivation to ensure the baby had express breast milk was so high, because she knew that that was a factor really critical to their immune beginnings. Now, even though I mentioned that the lactation rooms were definitely increasing with popularity with employers, this came out quite recently, and so I was sort of moved to put it into this presentation, understanding that there's some midterm elections coming up for you. And in actual fact, regardless of whether the baby's being breastfed or not, having American senators know that having babies working outside the home is not ideal for mother or for baby or for dad, and that it's probably more important that women have maternity leave or maternity support following their baby than being returning to work with the idea of having a lactation room for them. This is another woman who is in Parliament, I think, in Europe, and she's also had her baby with her the whole time that she's been working. Now, in July 2018, so very, very recently, there was a resolution that came through from Ecuador to encourage breastfeeding in the global support was actually threatened, unfortunately, by the United States. So what happens is the American officials, they didn't want the language to be protect, promote and support breastfeeding. They wanted the language to be quite different, to give more of a passage for policymakers with regard to infant formula. It was really interesting that, unfortunately, America said that if Ecuador refused to drop the resolution about this breastfeeding, that they would shift and change some of their trade measures and withdraw some of their crucial military aid. The Ecuadorian government decided to not go ahead with the resolution, but at the end of the day, Russia came through and made the resolution, and so it was passed passed regardless of what support they had had from other countries. So even though I know that everyone in America, like in New Zealand, is very supportive of breastfeeding, it's quite interesting that at that very, very key level, when there's resolutions to be made, where there's a huge amount of money to be factored in to that infant formula company and their ideal of having most babies use infant formula, that in the end, luckily in the end, Russia came through and moved that resolution regardless. So, for me, breastfeeding education starts very, very early. I was a 4-year-old when I lived in the Solomon Islands for a year. I won't tell you how that came about. But in that year, as a 4-year-old, I think I saw every single person that walked past me with a baby attached and breastfeeding. And so as a 4-year-old, I had no thought whatsoever that I would never be breastfeeding my children, because it was shown and it was modelled and it was normalised for me so much that I actually knew that this is what you do when you have a baby. This little girl here is gorgeous because she's so busy she doesn't have any time for anyone else to feed her baby. She's feeding her baby while she's doing the shopping, just like her mum probably has done. And this woman here, some of you might recognise, she's apparently a supermodel. And she got in a lot of trouble for putting this photo on her Instagram account because, for various reasons, I guess part of it is she doesn't have a top on, which for a supermodel or a Sports Illustrated model, that must be very, very strange. So this is her baby, her toddler, who has her own baby doll, who's asking mum to please feed my baby doll while you're feeding my baby sibling. And of course she's saying, of course I'll feed your baby, there's lots of milk. So essentially that little baby, that one there, and this little one here, they're never going to need to have a talk about breastfeeding. They're never going to have it explained to them why it's the best thing for their baby, because they've seen it, they know it, and probably, being curious, they've asked lots of questions. This is a woman who thinks that she can do everything, and she can, But essentially what can happen when you're breastfeeding is that you can almost pretty much do it in your sleep. So the baby, just because the mother's exhausted, tired and can't study anymore, the baby still wants to suck, the baby still wants to sleep, and essentially that mother, regardless of whether she's busy or not, is still going to be able to provide milk for her baby and still be able to provide nurturing and support in that little cosy little pillow that she's got there. This is a really interesting photo. Can anyone work out what she's doing? So she was at a swimming pool place, large swimming pool place. I'm not sure what you'd call it here. And she was in a tented area. She was with the people that she was having a lovely day with. And so she decided that she needed to express so that she could have feel more comfortable, but also have some milk for her baby when she was reunited with them. Unfortunately, the pool people were given complaints, and they were told that there was a woman in the cabana tent with all the other people in their swimming togs. However, this woman had pumps on her nipples, and she was very, very strange. And so she was escorted by this lovely gentleman here. He does have 2 legs. And he escorted her to a private area so that she could be not seen by the public, so that she could express quite happily and make this work. Now, I just find the fact that they're both in rapport, they're both with their leg up on the wall, and she just looks a tiny, tiny bit smug. He looks a tiny bit bored. But essentially, she was so dangerous in the swimming pool complex that she had to be removed so that she could express her milk quietly and unobtrusively somewhere else, so that we don't normalise that actually sometimes breastfeeding mums need a day out, and also breastfeeding mums, if they've got pumps, they can travel pretty much anywhere. This is another working mother who was working on the catwalk, and she was due to come out. And the lady who said to her, "It's your turn to come out," she said, "Oh, you're feeding. Do you want to come out with your baby as well? Is that all right with you?" So obviously baby's got earmuffs on so they can't hear the wonderful music, and she was applauded simply for being at work and getting on with things. Not many working mothers look like this in gold bikinis and on catwalks, but essentially there are many women who have busy lives, who have a busy home life and still can essentially breastfeed and get everything else done at the same time. I just think the baby should have been a bit more coordinated with her outfit so that it was a better shot. And then this, lastly, is a mother that we may have seen several times. She was feeding her baby in a restaurant, and someone said to her, "Would you please cover up because people are eating?" And so she said, "Of course, I'm so sorry." So she covered up so that no one could see that she was breastfeeding, and her baby continued regardless. And I mean, these photos are just sort of as a glimpse into what can go on. But essentially, the fact that a woman has been told that she can't do something in a restaurant, whereas everyone else in that restaurant is eating, is a little bizarre. I do appreciate that some people get quite shocked and surprised when they see breasts coming out at a restaurant to feed, but most women who are in that situation are very, very protective of their baby and very, very, I find, demure in their flashiness. So it's really interesting that even though this is still talked about and shown up to be something that shouldn't happen, that women all over the world are still feeding their babies in restaurants, and I think it should be encouraged. So essentially we're at the end of the talk now, but this is probably the most critical slide, because what happens is that when women are breastfeeding, they get lots of help, lots of support, lots of smiles, lots of "you're doing a good job" and "well done." I know that in America you call it nursing, so you're nursing your babies. For us, that would be like there's something wrong with your baby if you're nursing it, because that means they're sick. So you're nursing your sick baby? No, we breastfeed our babies. So one of the best things you can do is you can feed that woman. Even if you don't know her very well, drop off food parcels, drop off real food, encourage her to keep eating if her milk supply is low, encourage her to keep eating if she's tired, encourage her to eat as much food as she possibly can to ensure that she has a really good milk supply, not only for her baby to drink from, but also for her to maintain her energy levels. And I think this is critical if she has other children, because certainly little babies don't stop with their demands on mum just because of everything else that's going on in the family. So even if you don't know someone very well, just leave food at their front door and just say, you're doing a great job, and let me know if you need anything. Because as you might know, that quite often women in those first 6 weeks or so, they're too exhausted to even think about what they might need. So having food is a real plus. The second thing that you can do if you ever see someone who's feeding their baby, and it could be baby having infant formula, express milk, or it could be a baby breastfeeding, is I encourage you to go and either sit or stand near them, so not like a stalker, but just sit or stand near them, and certainly sit there and smile if you can, if you've got time, so that that woman isn't isolated on her own in public, and perhaps the brunt of someone coming up and telling her that she needs to move on. I'm sure that you have stories here, but we certainly do back in New Zealand, of women being asked to go to the restrooms, to the bathrooms, to feed where people are going, to the bathroom, because that's the place that you should be feeding a baby. So that's highly inappropriate, not only for the mum, but also for the baby. And essentially, that mum just needs to have a little bit of support, and she can continue doing what she's doing. I say that also with regarding feeding with a bottle, because we've got no idea if that baby's getting express breast milk or infant formula. But I think there's also a real risk with women today, if they are using infant formula, that they can be just as judged for that product as they can be judged if they're breastfeeding their baby. So I guess no more judgments, a little bit of support, and certainly smiling if you can, and being helpful. I've also known of people who have paid the bill for families who are sitting breastfeeding an infant, and just getting the cheque as they leave and saying the best thing you're doing is sitting and feeding that baby. So I think that's an amazing gift to give someone. And then lastly, be really careful about what you buy for small children, especially if what they buy comes with one of these. Because every time we buy a dolly which comes with a baby bottle, we are telling the manufacturers that this is how babies are fed. And so it's all very well buying it and throwing the bottle out. You've still given the message that we want all of our baby dolls to turn up with a bottle. And yet I've seen several children who've got baby dolls of different genders, as in like not all little girls, quite happy to feed a baby doll if it needs feeding, because they've got 2 dots on their chest. So yeah, be careful about what you buy, and make sure that the message gets to them that this is not the normal way for babies to be fed, and essentially they're much better to have like a nice breastfeeding top that child could wear as they have their baby, she says. Okay, and then lastly, this is the future of human milk. This little baby looking, trusting and believing in that human right that they have to access breast milk. And it's really important to know that the information, the message, and also the drive to continue with breast milk as first food only comes from the families, from the parents, and essentially from the mums. So don't let the stock exchange get in the way. Don't let the stock exchange take over simply because they have got a louder voice and they've got more money. What you need to do is encourage any family that you're working with to breastfeed. And I will say to people too, even if it's for one feed, even if it's for 1 week, even if it was for 2 months, it doesn't matter. It's not a competition. But essentially, going back to the microbiome, that is the beginning for them. And once that starts, then you can carry on with everything after that. So that's the end of the talk. I can just briefly tell you about what authentic resistance is, if you'd like to hear. So that started about 4 years ago, myself and another woman, and we teach families who've chosen not to vaccinate their children. We fast-track them. Instead of doing 80 hours on Google and getting told off for going to Google, we have a 6-hour course that essentially takes them from the beginning of their decision all the way through to the end of their decision. And the other woman who does it with me, she is an ex-vaccinator. So her job was giving flu jabs to corporates. So they get to listen to her as she talks about what's in a vaccine and what does the aluminium do and what are the antibodies made up of. And then they hear me talking about naturopathy and breast milk and essentially how you can deal with chickenpox, whooping cough, measles, mumps and also tetanus. So that's our talk, and we have, we've run it probably about maybe 40, 50 times in the last 4 years, and we're slowly getting more and more people who are not so much vaccinating or not vaccinating, they're just simply coming along to find out more. And I think that's the best thing for people to do, is to find out as much as they can and then essentially go and make their own decision. And remember, this is one decision. There's so many parenting decisions, but it's nice to have one that they can think, I've looked at it, I've made my mind up, I can put it to the side, instead of thinking for the first 5 years of that child's life, what will I do? I'm so stressed. What will I do? What will I do? Essentially, make up your mind, move on, get on with it. So, any questions?
Thank you. That was a fabulous presentation. Really, really appreciate that information from down under. Loved your accent. I was at a conference in Quebec last year at the International Milk Genomics Consortium, and there was a master's degree nurse who was lamenting the pasteurization of breast milk bank, the bank milk that mothers give to donate, and that premature infants were not doing well on it, and that they needed it in raw form. Could you speak to that a little bit about breast milking and any advances that might be going on about testing the donor versus pasteurizing the milk?
Definitely. So the donors that we have in New Zealand, when a woman gets pregnant, we have a range of blood tests. So HIV is checked, hepatitis B is checked, all of those things are checked. So essentially we've got one milk bank in New Zealand in Christchurch in the South Island, and women can donate to that breast bank, but their milk is all pasteurised. So essentially you've got a great product, it's white liquid and it's perfect for the baby, but it doesn't have the antibodies in it, which is what they would have if they had it from a live source. So that's probably for the premature babies, which you've just talked about. It's not ideal, but it's certainly better than infant formula. But what happens more so in our communities is that we have Facebook. We have 3 or 4 Facebook pages, and women who are specifically, for example, medication-free, gluten-free, dairy-free, alcohol-free, whatever they are free, they will set their profile and say, this is what I have available. If you'd like to get it, you can come and pick it up from my house. So it's not so much, there's no selling involved, and there's certainly no promises with regard to the quality of the milk. It's very much on a faith base. But it's certainly for people who realise that pasteurisation is really going to do nothing to help with that antibody involvement and certainly microbiome building. So it's much, much better that we promote that donor side of things, but there's a trust level of those women, you know, knowing that they're not having anything that could certainly be like an allergen for that baby. So it's interesting though about the milk banks, because you think about it, we've got blood banks everywhere. They work fine, and blood's kind of really important to get right. Milk banks would be far superior to, you know, like reduced testing and reduced having all those sorts of things that you have with getting the right blood type for the right person. So essentially, what is stopping the milk banks? What factor is stopping them go ahead and be really prolific and helpful for particularly prem babies, but for any baby? And I guess what's stopping it is the stock market. There's no money to be made out of women's breast milk. If we can make it into a product, freeze dry it and sell it on a shelf, that's when they'll be interested in milk banking. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great. I'll be here for the rest of the conference, so I'd love to catch up with you then. And for all of those who are breastfeeding, power be with you.